The rise of Solomon, a kingdom destined for glory. Imagine a young man, barely in his 20s, standing at the crossroads of history. He is the heir to a mighty kingdom, the son of a legendary warrior king. The weight of an entire nation rests on his shoulders. He has wealth, power, and the blessing of God himself. But what will he do with it? Solomon's story is not just another ancient tale, it's a drama of wisdom, power, and, ultimately, tragic downfall. A young ruler blessed beyond measure, yet cursed by his own choices. It is a story that starts with divine favor, and ends in ruin. The kingdom of Israel had reached its golden age. Under King David, its borders had expanded, its enemies had been crushed, and its capital, Jerusalem, stood as a beacon of divine favor. But David, the warrior poet, was aging. His final days were consumed by political intrigue, because every powerful king eventually faces the same problem, succession. David had many sons, and some of them were willing to kill for the throne. One of them, Adonijah, had already declared himself king before David even breathed his last. But the old lion had one final move left on the board. In an unexpected twist, he bypassed his more experienced sons and placed the crown on the head of a young man named Solomon. Solomon wasn't the firstborn. He wasn't a seasoned warrior. He was the son of Bathsheba, the woman David had taken after sending her husband to his death. His very existence was born from scandal. And yet, God had chosen him. But why? Imagine you're 20 years old, and overnight, you become the ruler of an empire. You sit on a golden throne, surrounded by generals, priests, and advisors twice your age. Every eye is on you, waiting to see if you will lead, or fail. Solomon could have been consumed by doubt. Instead, he did something remarkable, something that would define him forever. One night, in a dream, God appeared to him and said, "Ask for whatever you want, and I will give it to you." Pause for a moment. Let that sink in. This isn't just a genie offering 3 wishes. This is the creator of the universe handing a blank check to a young king. What would you ask for? Power? Wealth? A long life? Solomon's answer shocked even the heavens. "Lord, I am young. I don't know how to lead these people. Give me wisdom, so I can judge rightly." It was the request of a man who understood the magnitude of his role. And because Solomon asked for wisdom instead of riches or power, God gave him everything: wisdom greater than any man before him, wealth beyond measure, and a reign of peace unlike anything Israel had ever seen. It was the ultimate gift. But like all gifts, it came with responsibility. The first test of wisdom. Solomon's wisdom wasn't just theoretical, it was tested in ways that stunned his people. The most famous story? The 2 women who came before his throne, fighting over a newborn baby. Both women claimed to be the mother. No witnesses. No DNA tests. No way to know the truth. The court waited. What would the young king do? Then Solomon did something unthinkable. "Bring me a sword," he said. "Cut the baby in half. Give each woman a piece." Gasps echoed through the hall. What kind of judgment was this? A baby, divided? But in that moment, the real mother screamed, "No. Let her take the baby, just don't kill him." And just like that, Solomon knew the truth. The real mother would rather give up her child than see him harmed. The court erupted in awe. The boy king had wisdom beyond his years. But wisdom is only as good as the choices it leads you to make. A dangerous obsession begins. Solomon's early reign was marked by brilliance. He built alliances, expanded Israel's wealth, and, most importantly, constructed the greatest temple the world had ever seen, a house for the one true God. But something else was happening in the background. Something subtle. Something dangerous. Solomon had a weakness. And that weakness was women. Not just any women, foreign women. Daughters of kings. Exotic, beautiful, mysterious. Marriages in ancient times were political tools, and Solomon played the game better than anyone. Every new wife meant a new alliance, a new treaty, a new source of wealth. But there was a problem. God had commanded Israel's kings not to marry foreign women, because with them came foreign gods. And foreign gods demanded foreign altars. At first, Solomon seemed untouchable. He had everything: wealth, power, peace. But peace can make a man careless. Prosperity can make him forget why he was chosen in the first place. And so, slowly, subtly, the wisest man who ever lived started making the biggest mistake of his life. One wife became 10. 10 became 100. 100 became 1,000. And with them came the gods of their homelands. One day, it was just a small shrine outside the city. Then, a private altar in the palace. Then, a grand temple on the hilltops, where incense burned to gods with strange names. And before long, the king of Israel, the chosen one, the builder of God's temple, was kneeling before the idols of his wives. The man who once asked only for wisdom, had lost his way. This is where the story takes a dark turn. Solomon, the golden king, the wise judge, the architect of Israel's greatest age, had set something in motion that could not be undone. The question is, how far would he fall? And what would be the cost? Because when a man turns his back on wisdom, on truth, on the very God who gave him everything, there are always consequences. And for Solomon, those consequences would shake the foundations of a nation. What's next? In the next chapter, we'll go deeper into how Solomon's love for foreign women led him further into darkness. What exactly did he build for them? How did he justify his actions? And what warning does his story hold for us today? Because if even the wisest man in history can be led astray, what does that mean for the rest of us? The gift of wisdom. Why did God choose Solomon? What if you were given the power to ask for anything? What if the creator of the universe himself offered you limitless wealth, eternal youth, or absolute power? What would you choose? This is not a hypothetical question. This is the reality young Solomon faced. And his answer changed everything. Before we dive into Solomon's legendary wisdom, let's take a step back and ask the real question: why him? Think about it. Solomon wasn't the obvious choice for king. His father, David, had many sons, some older, some stronger, some with better military experience. The most obvious candidate was Adonijah, a powerful and charismatic prince who had already declared himself king before David was even dead. Yet, Solomon, the son of Bathsheba, the child born from the most infamous scandal in Israel's history, was chosen. This decision wasn't just David's, it was God's. But why? God sees beyond the surface. The answer lies in one of the greatest themes in the Bible: God does not choose as men do. Time and time again, we see this pattern. God doesn't pick the strongest, the richest, or the most obvious choice. He picks the unexpected. Abraham was an old man with no children. Moses was a stuttering fugitive. David was a shepherd boy, forgotten even by his own family. And Solomon? He was the son of a controversial marriage, a boy with no battlefield experience, a quiet thinker in a world of warriors. But God saw something in him. Now, let's get to the moment that changed history. Solomon had just taken the throne. He was young, some scholars believe around 20 years old, and the weight of ruling an entire nation was crushing. So what did he do? He went to Gibeon, a sacred high place, and made a staggering sacrifice: 1,000 burnt offerings. 1,000. This wasn't just a routine religious act. This was a declaration. A young king, standing before God, saying, "I cannot do this without you." And that night, something extraordinary happened. As Solomon slept, God appeared to him in a dream. "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Pause. Let that sink in. This isn't a fairy tale. This isn't a genie in a lamp. This is the creator of the universe offering a blank check. Imagine being in Solomon's shoes. You're a young king. You have enemies. You have an entire kingdom at your command. You could ask for anything. Most men, let's be honest, would have asked for power, for military dominance, for riches beyond measure. But Solomon? He asked for wisdom. The answer that shocked heaven: Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. But I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. Think about this. Solomon was already the king. He had power. He had wealth. He had an army. But he knew that ruling well required more than just authority. It required wisdom. And that's what he asked for. The humility in his request is what made it so powerful. He didn't say, "Make me the greatest king in history." He didn't say, "Make me invincible." He said, "I don't know how to do this. Teach me." And God was moved. The reward, more than he asked for, because you have asked for this, not for a long life, not for riches, not for the death of your enemies, I will give you what you asked for. I will make you wiser than anyone who has ever lived, and I will give you what you did not ask for, wealth and honor. No king will ever compare to you. Boom. Just like that, Solomon became the wisest man in human history. But more than that, he became one of the richest and most successful kings ever to rule. And all because he chose wisdom over power. Let's pause for a moment and ask, what does this teach us? Solomon's story is a reminder that wisdom is more valuable than wealth, power, or status. That true greatness doesn't come from taking, it comes from understanding. But there's something deeper here. Something we can't ignore. Solomon was given a gift beyond measure. But even he would later fall. Wisdom is powerful. But wisdom alone doesn't save a man. Because even the wisest man in history was not immune to temptation. And that is where his story begins to unravel. The temple, Solomon's greatest achievement. Imagine a structure so magnificent that its very name commands awe. A building so sacred that the presence of God himself would dwell within its walls. A temple unlike anything the world had ever seen, built by the wisest king in history. For Solomon, the construction of the temple of the Lord wasn't just a political project. It wasn't just a display of wealth or architectural brilliance. It was his legacy. It was his purpose. It was the greatest thing he would ever do. And yet, even this holy endeavor carried the seeds of his downfall. The temple of the Lord wasn't Solomon's idea. It was David's dream. King David, Solomon's father, was a warrior. He had conquered enemies, expanded Israel's borders, and secured the kingdom through blood and battle. But there was one thing David wanted more than anything else: to build a permanent house for God. Up until this point, Israel had worshipped in the tabernacle, a sacred tent, built during the time of Moses. It was temporary. Movable. And David knew that wasn't enough. "I live in a palace of cedar," David lamented, "but the ark of God dwells in a tent." So he made a plan. He gathered resources. He was ready to build. But then, God stopped him. "You have shed too much blood," the Lord told David. "You will not build my house. Your son will build it instead." And with that, the mission passed to Solomon. The warrior would not build God's house. The wise king would. The temple Solomon would build was no ordinary structure. It would be magnificent. It would be glorious. It would be the center of Israel's faith for generations to come. It stood 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high, not the largest temple in history, but the most sacred. The interior was lined with pure gold. The walls were decorated with intricate carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. The floor. Gold. The altar. Gold. The inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was overlaid with 20 tons of solid gold. Everything about this temple was designed to reflect one thing, the glory of God. The construction of the temple took 7 years. Think about that. 7 years of planning, engineering, carving, and crafting. Hundreds of thousands of workers, Israelites and foreign craftsmen, came together to build something that had never been seen before. And here's something fascinating, not a single iron tool was used inside the temple. The stones were cut and shaped far away so that, as the temple rose, it was built in absolute silence. No hammering. No chiseling. Just the quiet, sacred assembling of a structure that would house the presence of God Himself. It was the most sacred construction project in history. And when it was finally complete, Solomon stood before the people of Israel, and dedicated the temple with one of the most powerful prayers ever spoken. The day heaven touched earth pictured the moment. Tens of thousands of Israelites standing in awe. The golden temple gleaming in the sunlight. The priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the very seat of God's presence, into the Holy of Holies. And then, as Solomon prayed, something unbelievable happened. A thick cloud descended upon the temple. The glory of the Lord filled the house of God. The priests couldn't even stand to minister, the presence of God was too strong. Heaven itself had come down to dwell among men. Solomon, overwhelmed by the moment, lifted his voice, "But will God really dwell on earth? Even the highest heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built." It was a moment of pure worship, a moment where everything was perfect. But here's the thing about perfection. It never lasts. That night, after the grand dedication, God appeared to Solomon again. And this time, He had a warning. "I have heard your prayer. I have chosen this place for myself. But if you or your descendants turn away from me, if you follow other gods, I will cut Israel off from this land. This temple, which you have built, I will cast away. It will become a heap of ruins." It was a chilling prophecy. One that Solomon, at this point in his life, probably thought would never happen. After all, he was the wisest man on earth. He had built a temple for the one true God. He would never turn away, right? Right? Solomon had completed the greatest achievement of his life. But something else was happening at the same time. Something darker. The temple was God's house. But just beyond its golden gates, Solomon was already building something else. Palaces. Foreign shrines. Altars to gods he was never supposed to worship. It started small. A treaty here. A political marriage there. A few foreign customs brought into the royal court. But bit by bit, the foundation of Solomon's faith, like the stones of the temple itself, began to crack. The greatest irony here's where the story takes a tragic turn. Solomon built a house for God, but he also built houses for idols. He crafted the most sacred place on earth, but he also built altars to false gods. He prayed that God's name would be honored forever, but his own actions would set the stage for Israel's greatest disaster. The Temple of Solomon stood for hundreds of years. But God's warning was not an empty threat. Because when a man, even the wisest man in history, turns away from the one true God, there are always consequences. The women of Solomon, political strategy or fatal weakness. 1,000 women. 700 wives. 300 concubines. Was Solomon a brilliant political strategist, or a man consumed by his desires? For centuries, people have debated the truth behind Solomon's legendary harem. Was it part of a grand political strategy, uniting kingdoms through marriage? Or was it something far more dangerous, a weakness that led the wisest man in history to his downfall? The answer is both. Because what started as political genius, ended in spiritual disaster. In the ancient world, kings didn't marry for love. They married for power. Every royal marriage was a treaty, a way to secure alliances, prevent wars, and expand influence. If an Israelite king married the daughter of a foreign ruler, it meant peace between their nations. And Solomon? He mastered this game like no one else. By marrying daughters of foreign kings, Solomon strengthened Israel standing on the world stage. He didn't just rule Israel, he ruled a network of alliances stretching across the ancient Near East. Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Sidon, Solomon's wives came from every corner of the known world. It was a brilliant strategy. But it came with a dangerous cost. The very first marriage that marked Solomon's shift away from God was with the daughter of Pharaoh. This was huge. Israel and Egypt had a complicated history. Egypt had once enslaved the Israelites. Now, just a few generations later, Israel's king was married to Pharaoh's daughter. It was a massive political move. But here's the problem, God had specifically commanded Israel's kings not to marry foreign women. Do not intermarry with them, because they will turn your hearts toward other gods. Deuteronomy 7, verses 3 and 4, Solomon knew this command. Yet he ignored it. And once he had one foreign wife, what was stopping him from taking more? The snowball effect, one wife becomes 1,000 at first, these marriages were just diplomatic. But over time, they became personal. Solomon didn't just marry these women, he loved them. King Solomon loved many foreign women, from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them. 1 Kings 11, verses 1 and 2, pause for a moment. This isn't just a list of names in a history book. These were real women, each bringing their own gods, customs, and traditions into Solomon's palace. And Solomon? He embraced them. He allowed their idols into his home. He built them altars to worship their gods. And before long, the wisest man in the world, the same man who built the temple of the one true God, was bowing before false gods. What happened to Solomon is something we still see today. At first, he thought he was in control. He thought he could handle it. I'll marry them, but I won't worship their gods. But love is powerful. And what you love, you serve. One by one, the women whispered in his ear, Solomon, just come with me to the shrine, just once. Solomon, it's just a small offering, it's not a big deal. Solomon, if you love me, won't you honor my traditions? And Solomon, the man who once asked God for wisdom, the man who built the greatest temple in history, gave in. His wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord. 1 Kings 11, verse 4, this is where the shift happened. At first, Solomon loved God more than anything. Then, Solomon loved women more than anything. And eventually, Solomon loved what they loved. Solomon, the man who built the holy temple, built altars to false gods all over Jerusalem. He built high places for Ashtoreth, the seductive goddess of fertility. Molech, a god who demanded child sacrifice. Chemosh, a war god worshipped with brutal rituals. And these weren't just private shrines in his palace. These were public altars, massive, towering structures where thousands of Israelites followed their king into idolatry. This wasn't just personal sin anymore. This was national corruption. And God was watching. Solomon's betrayal of God wasn't a secret. It was public. It was bold. And it had consequences. God appeared to Solomon one last time, and this time, it wasn't with an offer of blessing. Since you have turned your heart away from me and worshipped other gods, I will tear the kingdom away from you. 1 Kings 11, verse 11, but there was one mercy. God wouldn't do it in Solomon's lifetime. Instead, He would wait until Solomon's son took the throne. Solomon's choices would destroy his legacy. And just as God warned, after Solomon's death, the kingdom of Israel split in two, never to be fully united again. Solomon thought he was building a strong kingdom. Instead, he built the ruins of a broken nation. He thought his marriages were strategic. Instead, they were the very thing that destroyed him. He thought his wisdom would keep him safe. Instead, his love for women led him away from wisdom itself. And isn't that always the danger? We think we're in control. We think we can handle compromise. We think we can balance our faith and our desires. But the truth is, what we love will always shape us. Solomon loved his wives more than he loved God. And because of that, he lost everything. What happens next? The wisest man in history became the most foolish. But here's the real question: did Solomon ever realize his mistake? Did he ever come back to God? And most importantly, what does his story mean for us today? Because if even Solomon could be led astray, what makes us think we are immune? "700 wives and 300 concubines, how was this even possible? 1,000 women. One man. How does that even work? Was Solomon a king with unmatched power, or a prisoner of his own desires?" To modern minds, the idea of one marriage is already complex enough. Yet Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's not just unusual, it's insane. How did he manage this? Did he even know all their names? Was this about power? About pleasure? Or was it something far more dangerous? The answer is all of the above. And as we unravel this mystery, we'll see how what looked like power became his greatest weakness. First, let's get one thing straight: Solomon's marriages were not just about romance. In the ancient world, kings married for alliances. A royal marriage wasn't just a relationship, it was a peace treaty. If a king married the daughter of another ruler, that ruler became his father-in-law. That meant less war. That meant trade agreements. That meant wealth and security. Solomon played this game better than anyone in history. When he married the daughter of Pharaoh, it wasn't just love, it was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Egypt was the most powerful empire of the time. By marrying Pharaoh's daughter, Solomon secured Egypt as an ally. Then he did it again. And again. And again. Moabite princess. Alliance secured. Ammonite princess. More territory. Sidonian princess. More trade routes. Hittite princess. More military support. 700 wives meant 700 alliances. From a political perspective, Solomon was a genius. From a spiritual perspective, it was a disaster waiting to happen. If the wives were about politics, then the 300 concubines were about pleasure. In the ancient world, a concubine was not just a mistress. She was a secondary wife, usually of lower status, but still part of the royal household. For Solomon, these women were not diplomatic pawns, they were part of his indulgence. 700 wives weren't enough. He wanted more. 300 more. What does that tell us? It tells us that Solomon had everything, but it was never enough. It started as strategy. It ended as addiction. How did he manage 1,000 women? Now, let's get practical. How does a single man manage 1,000 women? The truth is, he didn't. He couldn't possibly have had a deep connection with all of them. He wouldn't have spent time with most of them. Many of them probably never even saw him more than a few times. So why have so many? Because power corrupts. Because when you have everything, you start believing you deserve everything. Because desire is never satisfied. The irony is that Solomon, the wisest man in history, became enslaved by his own excess. The spiritual cost: women who worshipped other gods. Here's where things get really dangerous. God had warned Israel's kings, do not marry foreign women, because they will turn your heart to other gods. Deuteronomy 7, verses 3 and 4, Solomon ignored this command. And guess what? Exactly what God warned about happened. Each wife came with her own religion. Each wife brought her own gods. And Solomon, instead of leading them to worship the true God, followed them into idolatry. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. 1 Kings 11, verse 4, let that sink in. The wisest man alive, the man who built God's temple, was now worshipping false gods. This was the moment of no return. At first, Solomon probably thought he could control it. It's just a small shrine. It's just one offering. It's just to make her happy. But that's how temptation works. It starts small. Then it grows. Until one day, the man who once stood before the glory of God was now bowing before idols. And here's the worst part. He didn't just worship them in secret. He built temples for them. Solomon built high places for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the god of the Ammonites. 1 Kings 11, verse 7, do you know what Molech worship involved? Child sacrifice. Yes. The same man who built God's temple also built altars where people sacrificed their children. This is what happens when you compromise. This is what happens when you think you can handle sin. Even Solomon, the greatest king of Israel, fell. God had warned him. But Solomon didn't listen. And finally, God said, since you have turned your heart away from me, I will tear the kingdom from you. 1 Kings 11, verse 11, the consequences of Solomon's actions weren't just personal, they were national. After his death, his kingdom was ripped in two. The golden age of Israel was over. All because one man thought he was above God's warnings. The ultimate lesson: when enough is never enough. Solomon had it all. Wisdom, wealth, power. But it wasn't enough. 700 wives weren't enough. 300 concubines weren't enough. Why? Because when you chase desire, it never satisfies. Because when you turn from God, nothing fills the void. And Solomon, the wisest man in history, learned this lesson the hard way. What happens next? By the end of his life, Solomon realized his mistake. And he left us one final message, one last warning, written in the book of Ecclesiastes. A message that begins with some of the most haunting words ever written: meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Because when a man has everything except God, he has nothing. Foreign wives, how they changed the king, the wisest man in history. The richest king to ever live. The man chosen by God himself. And yet, in the end, Solomon was brought down, not by war, not by enemies, but by the women he loved. How does a man who spoke with God turn to idols? How does a man who built the greatest temple for the Lord build altars for false gods? How does wisdom itself fall? The answer: one compromise at a time. This is the story of how Solomon's foreign wives changed the course of his life, and the fate of an entire nation. A dangerous obsession. Solomon had everything a man could want. Wisdom beyond human comprehension. A kingdom at peace. Wealth beyond measure. But it wasn't enough. He wanted more. And for Solomon, more meant women. Not just any women, foreign women. Women from Moab, a nation known for its seductive pagan rituals. Women from Ammon, where people worshipped gods that demanded human sacrifice. Women from Sidon, where the goddess Ashtoreth ruled, a deity of fertility, lust, and ritual prostitution. Women from Egypt, the land of Pharaoh, who claimed to be a living god himself. 700 wives. 300 concubines. 1,000 women. And every single one of them brought their own gods into Solomon's palace. At first, Solomon probably thought he was in control. It's just a marriage for political reasons. I won't worship their gods, but I'll let them have their own beliefs. A little compromise won't hurt. But that's how sin works. It never asks for everything at once. It starts small. It whispers instead of shouts. And before long, the most sacred place on earth, Solomon's heart, was filled with things that didn't belong there. King Solomon loved many foreign women, and his wives turned his heart away from the Lord. 1 Kings 11, verse 1, at first, Solomon was the one leading. But by the end, he was the one being led. The greatest irony of Solomon's life is this: the man who built the holy temple for the Lord, also built temples for pagan gods. Solomon built high places for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the god of the Ammonites. 1 Kings 11, verse 7, think about this. Chemosh and Molech were gods that demanded child sacrifice. And yet Solomon, the king who once prayed for wisdom, the man who once dedicated Israel to the Lord, built places where innocent children were burned alive. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a complete betrayal of everything he once stood for. Solomon didn't wake up one morning and say, "I think I'll betray God today." It was gradual. One compromise at a time. One wife's request at a time. One idol in the palace at a time. His wives changed him not by force, but by influence. They didn't command him to turn away from God. They simply invited him. "Solomon, just come with me to my temple, just once. Solomon, just make a small offering to my God, it's a tradition. Solomon, if you love me, won't you respect my faith?" And little by little, the man who once stood in the presence of God was now kneeling before statues of stone. And the worst part? He didn't even realize how far he had fallen. Solomon thought he could balance everything. He thought he could worship the Lord, and still allow the gods of his wives. He thought he could be wise, and still make foolish choices. But God will not be ignored. One night, God appeared to Solomon. And this time, it wasn't with a blessing. It was a warning. "Since you have turned your heart away from me and have worshipped other gods, I will tear the kingdom away from you." 1 Kings 11, verse 11, God had been patient. He had warned Solomon many times. But Solomon ignored him. And so, God's judgment came down. Solomon's kingdom would be divided. His descendants would suffer. And the glorious golden age of Israel, the one Solomon had built, would come crashing down. All because he let his love for women overpower his love for God. The greatest tragedy here is what makes this story so painful. Solomon knew better. He wasn't a fool. He wasn't weak. He wasn't ignorant. He was the wisest man in history. And he still fell. Because wisdom only protects you if you listen to it. And no amount of intelligence can save a man who ignores the voice of God. What this means for us today: Solomon's story is not just ancient history. It's a warning. Because we live in a world where we think we can handle compromise. I can watch this, it won't affect me. I can be around this, but it won't change me. I can love God, but still hold on to this other thing. But what you allow into your life will shape your heart. And what you love most will control you. Solomon thought he could have both. But in the end, he lost everything. What happens next? Solomon's fall was great, but the question remains, did he ever realize his mistake? Did he ever turn back? And what was his final message to the world before he died? Because in his last years, Solomon wrote a book where he looked back at his life and told the truth. A book that begins with some of the most haunting words ever written: meaningless. Meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Because when a man has everything except God, he has nothing. From devotion to idolatry, the first step toward the fall. Every great downfall starts with one small step. A single compromise. A single justification. A single moment where a man tells himself, "This is fine." But it's never fine. The story of Solomon is not just a tale of power and wisdom, it is a tragedy of slow corruption. He didn't fall overnight. He didn't wake up one morning and decide to betray God. No. It happened gradually. One small choice at a time. And before he knew it, he was no longer the man he used to be. How does the wisest man in history turn away from the God who gave him everything? Let's go back to where it all began. In the beginning, Solomon wasn't just a wise king. He was a devoted man of faith. He loved the Lord. He followed his commands. He honored his father David's legacy. His heart was pure. His intentions were good. When God appeared to him in a dream and offered him anything he wanted, Solomon didn't ask for riches, power, or long life. He asked for wisdom, not for himself, but to lead the people righteously. And because of this, God blessed him beyond measure. Solomon built the most glorious temple in history, a house where God's very presence would dwell. He prayed before the nation. He worshipped with all his heart. He led Israel into its golden age. He was everything a king should be. But even the strongest man will fall if he lets the wrong things into his heart. And for Solomon, the first crack appeared in his love life. God had made one thing crystal clear to Israel's kings: you must not marry foreign women, because they will turn your heart toward other gods. Deuteronomy 7, verses 3 and 4, it wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't just an old tradition. It was a direct command from God. Solomon knew this. But he ignored it. At first, it was just one foreign wife, the daughter of Pharaoh. Then, another. Then, another. And before long, he had 1,000. Little by little, Solomon was allowing foreign gods into his home. Not because he believed in them. Not because he wanted to worship them. But because he loved his wives more than he loved obedience. At first, Solomon probably thought, it's just a marriage. It doesn't mean I'll worship their gods. I'm still loyal to the Lord. This is just politics. What harm could it do? But that's the thing about sin. It never asks for everything at once. It starts small. It seems harmless. But it always grows. One day, Solomon let his wives burn incense to their gods. Then, he let them build a small shrine outside the city. Then, he let them worship freely in Jerusalem. Then, he built altars for them himself. And eventually, Solomon, the man who built the temple of God, was now kneeling before idols. How did he get here? One step at a time. The moment Solomon stopped feeling guilty about his choices, was the moment he was truly lost. He didn't wake up every morning thinking, I am a traitor to God. No. He justified it. I'm still serving the Lord, this is just a way to keep peace with my wives. God understands. It's just politics. I built the temple. Surely, God won't be upset if I make a few accommodations. But sin doesn't work like that. Once you make peace with it, it takes over. Once you stop resisting, it controls you. And before Solomon knew it, he wasn't just allowing idol worship. He was participating in it. Solomon's heart was not fully devoted to the Lord as the heart of David his father had been. 1 Kings 11, verse 4, the man who once prayed to God with tears in his eyes, now bowed before gods of stone and wood. And he didn't even see the difference anymore. Here's the terrifying part of Solomon's story. God appeared to him twice. Twice, he warned Solomon. Twice, he told him to turn back. And Solomon? He didn't listen. At first, he thought, I can handle this. Then, he thought, it's not a big deal. And finally, he thought, it's too late now. His sin became normal. His disobedience became a lifestyle. And that's when God finally said, enough. Since you have turned your heart away from me, I will tear the kingdom away from you. 1 Kings 11, verse 11, Solomon lost everything. The golden kingdom he built was divided. The legacy he wanted was destroyed. And all because he took one small step, that led him to a place he never intended to go. Solomon's story is not just ancient history. It is a warning. Because no one falls in an instant. People don't wake up one day and suddenly destroy their lives. It happens slowly. A small compromise. A little justification. A choice that seems harmless, until it isn't. And before you know it, you're a completely different person. You don't pray like you used to. You don't feel conviction like you used to. You're far from God, and you don't even know how you got there. That's what happened to Solomon. And that's what can happen to anyone who lets compromise take root in their heart. What happens next? Solomon's fall was complete. But the question remains, did he ever realize his mistake? Did he ever return to God? And in his final years, what did he want us to know? Because before he died, Solomon wrote one last book, a book where he looked back at his life and told the painful truth. A book where he finally admitted, I had it all, and it meant nothing. Altars to pagan gods, why did Solomon break the law? How does a man who once stood in the very presence of God, bow before lifeless idols? How does a king who built the greatest temple in history, also build altars to false gods? How does the wisest man in the world, make the most foolish mistake imaginable? The story of Solomon's fall is not just a tale of political alliances or personal weakness, it is the story of a man who knew better, but still chose wrong. Because when Solomon built altars to pagan gods, he didn't do it out of ignorance. He did it with full knowledge of what he was doing. And that's what makes his betrayal so tragic. So the real question is, why? Why did Solomon, the king who had everything, break the very laws that made Israel great? Let's go back to where it all began. God had made one thing absolutely clear to Israel's kings: do not follow other gods, do not bow down to them, and do not serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Exodus 20, verse 5, this was not a suggestion. This was the foundation of Israel's relationship with God. For generations, the Israelites had seen firsthand what happened when they turned to idols, the golden calf at Mount Sinai. 3,000 people died because of it. The worship of Baal in the book of Judges. It led to centuries of slavery and suffering. Solomon knew this history. He knew what happened to kings who disobeyed God. And yet, he still chose to break the law. Why? Because his heart had changed. And that change didn't happen overnight. At first, Solomon didn't set out to betray God. He probably told himself, this isn't about me. I'm just building this altar for my wife. It's just a political move, nothing personal. God knows I still love him. This is just to keep peace in my kingdom. But the problem with justifying sin is that once you allow a little, you'll soon allow a lot. The first small shrine outside Jerusalem probably didn't seem like a big deal. But it opened the door. And once the door was open, Solomon stopped trying to close it. What started as one altar, became dozens. The Bible tells us that Solomon built high places for multiple gods, including Ashtoreth, the seductive goddess of fertility and sex, worshipped through temple prostitution. Molech, the god of the Ammonites, who demanded child sacrifice. Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, associated with human offerings and brutal rituals. And these weren't small, hidden altars. These were huge, public monuments. They were built on the very hills overlooking Jerusalem, the city where God's own temple stood. Can you imagine the insult? People walking up to worship at Solomon's golden temple, while others climbed the hills to burn sacrifices to false gods, gods that demanded blood, lust, and human lives. This wasn't just personal sin anymore. This was national corruption. Here's where things get really dangerous. At some point, Solomon stopped feeling guilty. Idol worship became normal. The same king who once stood before Israel and prayed, "Lord, may we never turn away from you," was now funding temples for idols. And the worst part? The people followed his example. The king's heart is like a stream of water in the hand of the Lord, he directs it wherever he pleases. Proverbs 21, verse 1, if the king was faithful, the people were faithful. If the king turned to idols, the people would turn to idols. And that's exactly what happened. What started as Solomon's personal sin became Israel's national downfall. The greatest irony of Solomon's life is this: the man who built the holy temple for the Lord, also built temples for pagan gods. Let that sink in. The same hands that designed the golden doors of God's temple were now laying bricks for the altars of demons. And here's the worst part: Solomon probably thought he was still serving God. He never renounced Yahweh. He still believed in the one true God. But he also believed he could have both. He thought he could worship God, and still allow idols in his life. And that's the most dangerous lie of all. Because God does not share his throne. You cannot serve both God and idols. Matthew 6, verse 24, Solomon thought he was wise enough to control his compromises. Instead, his compromises controlled him. One night, after years of warning, God spoke to Solomon one last time. And this time, it wasn't a blessing. It was a warning of destruction. Since you have turned your heart away from me, I will tear the kingdom from you. 1 Kings 11, verse 11, the punishment. Solomon's dynasty would crumble. His kingdom would be divided. Israel would never fully recover from his mistakes. And worst of all, after Solomon's death, his own son would be the one to lose everything. Solomon's choices didn't just affect him. They affected his children, his people, his nation. That's the cost of sin. It never stays small. It always spreads. And it always destroys. Solomon's story is not just ancient history. It is a mirror for our world today. Because how many people still believe they can serve both God and idols? I can be a Christian, but still compromise in this one area. I still love God, but I don't have to follow everything in the Bible. I know this isn't right, but it's just a small thing. But small sins don't stay small. Compromise always grows. And if Solomon, the wisest man in history, could be led astray, what makes us think we are any different? The wrath of God. What happened after Solomon's betrayal? For years, God was patient. For years, he warned Solomon. For years, he waited for the wisest man in history to wake up and return to him. But Solomon never did. And so, at last, the judgment of God fell. The golden age of Israel, an era of wealth, peace, and prosperity, was about to shatter. Not because of war. Not because of enemies. But because one man refused to obey God. What happened after Solomon's fall wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was the beginning of Israel's greatest disaster. The final warning: God confronts Solomon. Solomon had been warned twice before. The first time, after he built the temple, God told him, "If you turn away from me and worship other gods, I will reject this temple, and I will remove my blessing from Israel." 1 Kings 9, verse 6, the second time, after he began building altars for pagan gods, God warned him again. But Solomon ignored both warnings. So, God appeared one last time. And this time, he didn't come with a promise. He came with a sentence. Because you have done this and have not kept my covenant, I will tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your servants. 1 Kings 11, verse 11, the judgment was final. Solomon's dynasty would be broken. His nation would be divided. And Israel, once the most powerful kingdom on earth, would begin its long descent into destruction. Almost immediately after this prophecy, Israel started falling apart. First, internal rebellion began. For years, Solomon had ruled without opposition. No one dared challenge him. But as soon as God declared judgment, enemies rose up. Hadad the Edomite, a former enemy of King David, suddenly returned from exile, stirring rebellion in the south. Rezin of Damascus, a former military commander, established an independent kingdom in the north, attacking Israel's borders. Jeroboam, a young Israelite official, began plotting against Solomon, gathering support from the people. The kingdom wasn't stable anymore. And for the first time, Solomon, the man who had controlled everything, realized he was losing control. Among all of Solomon's enemies, one man stood out. His name was Jeroboam. He wasn't a foreign king. He wasn't an outside invader. He was one of Solomon's own officials. And he was about to steal everything from Solomon's family. One day, as Jeroboam was walking outside Jerusalem, he was approached by a prophet named Ahijah. Ahijah did something shocking. He took off his robe, tore it into 12 pieces, and handed 10 of them to Jeroboam. Take these 10 pieces, for this is what the Lord says, I am tearing the kingdom away from Solomon and giving 10 tribes to you. 1 Kings 11, verse 31, this was huge. It meant that Solomon's kingdom, the kingdom that had once stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates, was about to be ripped apart. And 10 of Israel's 12 tribes would be given to a servant instead of Solomon's son. Why? Because Solomon had abandoned God. When Solomon heard about this prophecy, he was furious. The same king who had once ruled with wisdom and patience now became paranoid and ruthless. He ordered Jeroboam to be killed immediately. But Jeroboam escaped to Egypt, where Pharaoh protected him. And so, Solomon, the king who once ruled with divine wisdom, was now a desperate man, trying to stop a prophecy from coming true. But he couldn't stop it. Because when God speaks judgment, no man can stop it. Solomon was no longer the man he used to be. The king who once prayed for wisdom, now ignored God's voice. The king who once led Israel in worship, now worshipped false gods. The king who once feared nothing, now feared his own people. And then, in the midst of political chaos, rebellion, and God's judgment, Solomon died. Just like that. No great battle. No heroic ending. Just, the slow, tragic death of a man who had everything, but lost the only thing that mattered. And his kingdom died with him. Solomon had spent 40 years building a kingdom. He had spent decades making Israel the most powerful nation on earth. And in the end, it only took one generation to destroy it. Because the very next king, Solomon's own son, would lose everything. The kingdom would split in two. The glory of Israel would fade. And the temple Solomon built, one day, it would be burned to the ground. Everything Solomon worked for, everything he built, everything he thought would last forever, was lost. And it all started with one small compromise. The lesson we cannot ignore: Solomon's story is not just ancient history. It is a warning. Because sin always has consequences. And when a man ignores God's warnings long enough, eventually, judgment comes. Solomon thought he could balance worshiping God and worshiping idols. Solomon thought he could make small compromises and still be faithful. Solomon thought God's patience meant God would never punish him. But he was wrong. Because God is merciful, but he is also just. And no man, not even the wisest king in history, can escape the consequences of sin forever. The consequences of Solomon's sins for Israel: one man's compromise can destroy a nation. One leader's failure can shape history for centuries. One decision, one mistake, one moment of weakness, can change everything. Solomon wasn't just any king. He was the ruler of God's chosen people. He was the man who built the greatest kingdom Israel had ever seen. But he was also the man who caused it to collapse. Because when Solomon turned from God, he didn't just bring disaster upon himself. He cursed his entire nation. And Israel would never be the same again. The day the kingdom was broken, Solomon ruled for 40 years. For 4 decades, Israel was rich, powerful, and secure. But as Solomon fell into idolatry, cracks began to form in his kingdom. And the moment he died, those cracks split the nation in two. His son Rehoboam inherited the throne. But instead of continuing his father's reign of peace, Rehoboam made a fatal mistake. The people came to him and said, "Your father put a heavy burden on us with taxes and labor. Lighten the load, and we will serve you." 1 Kings 12, verse 4, Solomon had built a kingdom of gold, but he had done it by taxing his people heavily and forcing them into labor. Now they were tired. Now they wanted change. And they gave Rehoboam a choice: show mercy, and the kingdom would stay united. Be harsh, and the people would rebel. Rehoboam chose wrong. He told them, "My father made your yoke heavy, I will make it even heavier. My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions." 1 Kings 12, verse 14, it was a disaster. The people revolted. And just like that, the kingdom of Israel was torn in half. Because of Solomon's sins, God had warned him, "I will tear the kingdom away from you, but for the sake of your father David, I will not do it in your lifetime. Instead, I will take it from your son." 1 Kings 11, verse 12, and that's exactly what happened. The 10 northern tribes followed Jeroboam and became the kingdom of Israel. The 2 southern tribes remained under Rehoboam and became the kingdom of Judah. One nation became 2. One golden empire became a divided and weakened land. And from that moment on, Israel would never be the same again. Jeroboam's great sin, idolatry, spreads like a plague. The northern kingdom, led by Jeroboam, had a problem. The temple of the Lord, the center of true worship, was in Jerusalem, which was now part of the southern kingdom. Jeroboam feared that if his people kept going to the temple to worship, they might start following Rehoboam again. So he made a deadly decision. He built 2 golden calves and told the people, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." 1 Kings 12, verse 28, it was history repeating itself. Just like in the days of Moses, when Israel built a golden calf at Mount Sinai. Now, under Jeroboam, Israel was turning to idolatry again. And it all started with Solomon's sins. Because when one generation compromises, the next generation falls even further. After the kingdom was split, things got worse, and worse, and worse. For 400 years, both Israel and Judah were ruled by kings. Some were righteous, but most were wicked. Many of them built idols in the cities, sacrificed children to false gods, led the people deeper into sin. And all of this, every single bit of it, traces back to Solomon's disobedience. Because when the wisest man in history turned away from God, he set a chain reaction in motion. And once it started, it couldn't be stopped. The ultimate consequence, the fall of Israel and Judah. For centuries, God sent prophet after prophet to warn the people, "Turn back to me, or judgment is coming." But they didn't listen. They had followed Solomon's example, not David's. And in the end, both kingdoms were destroyed. The fall of Israel, 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire invaded the northern kingdom. The people of Israel were exiled and scattered across the earth. The nation of Israel ceased to exist. The fall of Judah, 586 BC, the Babylonians attacked Jerusalem. They burned Solomon's temple to the ground. They took the people into slavery. The nation that was once the greatest in the world, was no more. And it all started with one man's disobedience. Solomon's legacy, the rise and fall of a kingdom. Solomon was supposed to build Israel into a light for the nations. Instead, his sins led it into darkness. What was supposed to be a kingdom of God became a kingdom of idols. And eventually, it became no kingdom at all. Solomon's story is not just history. It is a warning. Because sin doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone around you. Solomon's sins cost him his dynasty. Solomon's sins cost his son the throne. Solomon's sins led an entire nation to ruin. And if the wisest man in history could make that mistake, what makes us think we're any different? Because how many people today are repeating Solomon's story? Choosing idols over God. Choosing compromise over obedience. Choosing temporary pleasure over eternal truth. And just like in Solomon's day, God is patient. But judgment always comes. What happens next? Solomon's mistakes destroyed a nation. But before he died, he realized his error. And he left behind one final message, a warning to everyone who would come after him. A message that begins with some of the most haunting words ever written: meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Because at the end of his life, Solomon understood something terrifying: everything he built was lost. Everything he gained was empty. And in the next chapter, we will dive into Solomon's final years, his regrets, and the one lesson he learned too late. Because in his last days, Solomon had one final warning for the world. And it's a warning we cannot afford to ignore. Ecclesiastes, the king's final reflections. A man who had everything: power, wisdom, riches beyond imagination. A man who built the greatest temple in history. A man who ruled over a golden age of peace and prosperity. And yet, as he neared the end of his life, Solomon looked at everything he had achieved, and called it meaningless. How does a man who once held all the answers end his life with more questions than ever? How does a king who once prayed for wisdom, reach the conclusion that nothing in this world truly matters? The book of Ecclesiastes is Solomon's final confession. It is the diary of a man who had it all, yet realized too late that he had nothing. And its message is more relevant today than ever before. The most haunting words ever written. Solomon begins Ecclesiastes with a phrase that echoes through history: meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 2, let that sink in. This is not a poor man speaking. Not a man who failed in life. Not a man who suffered and never tasted success. This is the richest, wisest, most powerful man of his generation. And after decades of chasing pleasure, power, and knowledge, he comes to one shocking conclusion: it was all empty. Throughout Ecclesiastes, Solomon looks back on his life and analyzes everything he pursued. And what he finds is deeply disturbing. 1. The pursuit of knowledge. Wisdom is not enough. Solomon was the wisest man in history. Yet even wisdom did not satisfy him. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow, the more knowledge, the more grief. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 18, he realized that knowing more didn't mean he was happier. In fact, it often made life more painful. The more he understood the world, the more he saw its injustice, its corruption, its fleeting nature. And he realized, wisdom alone cannot give life meaning. 2. The pursuit of pleasure. I denied myself nothing. After wisdom failed to satisfy him, Solomon turned to pleasure. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He threw lavish feasts. He drank the finest wine. He surrounded himself with entertainment and laughter. And yet, after indulging in every pleasure imaginable, he still felt empty. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired, I refused my heart no pleasure. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 2, verses 10 and 11, no matter how much pleasure he consumed, it never lasted. Because pleasure is temporary, but emptiness always returns. 3. The pursuit of wealth, money solves nothing. Solomon was the richest man alive. His kingdom was overflowing with gold, silver, and treasures from every nation. Yet when he looked at his wealth, he realized, whoever loves money never has enough, whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. Ecclesiastes 5, verse 10, money couldn't stop time. Money couldn't stop death. Money couldn't stop the feeling of emptiness. And in the end, he would die just like the poorest beggar. So what was the point? 4. The pursuit of legacy, nothing lasts. Maybe, Solomon thought, the key to meaning is leaving something behind. A legacy. A name that would be remembered forever. But then he realized, even that was pointless. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 11, everything he built, his kingdom, his palaces, his wealth, would one day belong to someone else. And who knows if that person would be wise or foolish. Spoiler, his son Rehoboam would be foolish, and within a few years, the kingdom would be divided. So what was the point of building anything, if it was all going to be lost? At this point, Solomon was staring into the abyss of despair. Wisdom failed him. Pleasure failed him. Wealth failed him. Legacy failed him. But then, as Ecclesiastes nears its end, something shifts. Solomon finally finds the answer he had been searching for. The only thing that truly matters. And it's this: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13, in the end, everything else fades. Only God remains. Only obedience matters. Because in the end, God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 14, that's the final message of the wisest man who ever lived. After chasing everything the world had to offer. After falling into sin, idolatry, and regret, Solomon realized the truth. Nothing in this world will satisfy you. Only God can. Solomon learned this lesson too late. He saw the truth, but he had already wasted most of his life chasing emptiness. And that's what makes Ecclesiastes so powerful. It's not just a book of wisdom. It's a warning. A warning to the young, not to waste their strength on meaningless pursuits. A warning to the rich, that wealth will never fill the void. A warning to the ambitious, that legacy will fade into dust. Because if the greatest king in history, with all his power, riches, and knowledge, couldn't find happiness in those things, neither will we. Can wisdom save a man from sin? The wisest man in history fell into the deepest sin. The man who spoke directly with God turned to false idols. The man who had all the answers, still made all the wrong choices. So that raises the big question: if Solomon was the wisest man on earth, why didn't wisdom save him? And more importantly, if wisdom couldn't protect Solomon, how can it protect us? The answer is one of the most shocking truths in all of Scripture. Because as we'll see, wisdom alone is never enough. The great lie, if I'm smart, I won't fall. Let's be honest, most people think wisdom and intelligence will keep them from making bad choices. I am not foolish, I would never fall into that trap. I understand right and wrong, I will make the right decision when the time comes. I know the dangers, I will not make the same mistakes other people do. Solomon knew better than anyone that idolatry was evil. He knew better than anyone that marrying foreign wives would lead to sin. He knew better than anyone that God punishes disobedience. And yet, he did all of it anyway. So what went wrong? The answer is simple: wisdom is useless if you do not obey it. The difference between wisdom and obedience: many people confuse wisdom with righteousness. But they are not the same thing. Wisdom is knowing what is right. Obedience is choosing to do it. Wisdom is having the answer. Obedience is acting on it. Wisdom is understanding the danger. Obedience is running from it. And this is where Solomon failed. He had wisdom, but he lacked self-control. He had knowledge, but he lacked discipline. And in the end, it did not matter how much he knew, because he refused to follow what he knew was right. What does the Bible say about this? Solomon himself wrote one of the clearest warnings about this problem: the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 9, verse 10, notice what he says: wisdom begins with fearing God. That means if you lose your fear of God, your wisdom becomes useless. And that is exactly what happened to Solomon. He started his reign fearing God. But over time, he became comfortable with compromise. And once he stopped fearing the consequences of his actions, he stopped following wisdom altogether. What makes Solomon's downfall even more tragic is that he wrote the very warnings he ignored. In the book of Proverbs, Solomon gives clear instructions on how to avoid sin. But as we'll see, he did not listen to his own advice. First warning: stay away from immoral women. Solomon warned, the lips of an immoral woman drip honey, but in the end, she is bitter as gall. Her feet go down to death. Proverbs 5, verses 3 through 5, and yet, Solomon took 700 wives and 300 concubines. He ignored his own wisdom. Second warning: trust in the Lord, not your own understanding. Solomon wrote, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Proverbs 3, verses 5 through 6, and yet, Solomon trusted his political strategy more than he trusted God. He leaned on his own wisdom, and it led him straight into idolatry. Third warning: do not follow the ways of the wicked. Solomon warned, do not set foot on the path of the wicked, avoid it, do not travel on it, turn from it and go on your way. Proverbs 4, verses 14 through 15, and yet, Solomon did not just walk near the path of wickedness, he built roads to it. He funded idol worship. He built temples for false gods. And in the end, he became the very fool he warned others about. The hard truth: wisdom will not save you without discipline. Here is the reality: you can be the smartest person in the world, and still ruin your life. You can be brilliant and still make terrible choices. You can be educated and still follow destructive habits. You can be wise and still ignore what you know is right. Because at the end of the day, wisdom is useless if you do not act on it. Solomon had more wisdom than any man in history. But wisdom did not stop him from loving the wrong women. Wisdom did not stop him from compromising with sin. Wisdom did not stop him from walking away from God. And if wisdom could not save Solomon, it will not save us either, unless we obey it. So what can save us? If wisdom alone cannot protect us, what can? The answer is simple: a heart that obeys God. This is why Jesus said, whoever hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. Matthew 7, verse 24, notice what he says: wisdom is not just hearing the truth. Wisdom is doing it. Solomon heard the truth. But he did not live it. And that is why he fell. The lesson we must learn: Solomon's story is a warning to all of us. Because how many people today have knowledge, but no discipline? They know what is right, but they do not do it. They know the dangers of sin, but they play with it anyway. They know God's commands, but they think they can ignore them. But Solomon proves one terrifying truth: knowing the truth does not matter, if you refuse to follow it. And the only thing that truly saves a man is a heart that submits to God. Modern parallels: how to avoid Solomon's mistakes. The wisest man in history made the greatest mistakes. The king who built God's temple also built altars for demons. The man who had everything still lost it all. Solomon's story is not just ancient history. It is a warning for today. Because the same traps that ruined Solomon's life are still destroying lives today. And if the wisest man in history could be deceived, what makes us think we are any different? So what were Solomon's mistakes? And how can we avoid repeating them? Mistake 1: thinking success makes you untouchable. Solomon had everything. He was the king of the most powerful nation on earth. He was the richest man in the world. He was so wise that rulers traveled for months just to hear him speak. And yet, he fell. Because success does not make you safe. Power does not make you immune to sin. And wisdom does not make you incapable of foolishness. Solomon thought he was too strong to fall. But he forgot one thing: pride always comes before the fall. Modern parallel: the illusion of invincibility. How many people today fall into the same trap? The businessman who builds an empire but loses his family. The celebrity who reaches the top but destroys their own career with addictions. The pastor who preaches righteousness but secretly lives in sin. We think that success proves we are doing the right thing. But Solomon's life proves a harsh reality: you can be successful and still be lost. Because success means nothing if your heart is far from God. Mistake 2: letting small compromises grow. Solomon did not wake up one day and say, "I think I will betray God today." No. His fall happened slowly. One small compromise at a time. First, he married one foreign wife. Then, he married 10 more. Then, he married 100. Then, he married 1,000. Each time, he told himself, "It's just a small thing. I can handle it." Until one day, he was kneeling before idols, worshipping false gods. His small compromises became his downfall. Modern parallel: the danger of justification. How many people today say things like, "It's just one drink, I am not an alcoholic. It's just a little lie, it won't hurt anyone. It's just one website, I can stop whenever I want." But small sins never stay small. They grow. They take control. And before you know it, you are a different person than you ever thought you would be. That is how Solomon fell. And that is how people fall every single day. Mistake 3: loving the wrong thing. Solomon's greatest weakness was his love for foreign women. Not because women are evil, but because they led his heart away from God. He did not just marry them, he worshipped their gods. His love for people became greater than his love for God. And that destroyed him. Modern parallel: misplaced love. What do people love too much today? Money, chasing wealth instead of chasing God. Sex, worshipping pleasure instead of holiness. Power, living for influence instead of truth. Approval, caring more about what people think than what God thinks. Solomon's mistake was not loving women. His mistake was loving them more than he loved God. And whatever you love most will control you. If you love money more than God, it will own you. If you love pleasure more than God, it will ruin you. If you love power more than God, it will corrupt you. Solomon learned this too late. Will we? Mistake 4: ignoring God's warnings. God warned Solomon many times. But Solomon ignored every warning. And in the end, God took the kingdom from him. Because no matter how much God loves you, He will not tolerate disobedience forever. How many people today feel God pulling them back, but ignore Him? I know I should stop, but I will fix it later. I know God is convicting me, but I am not ready to change. I know this is wrong, but it is too late now. That is exactly what Solomon thought. And in the end, it cost him everything. If you ignore God's voice long enough, eventually, you will not hear it anymore. That is the danger of ignoring warnings. And that is why Solomon's story is so terrifying. Because he was not a fool. He was wise. And he still ignored the truth. How can we avoid Solomon's mistakes? So if wisdom alone did not save Solomon, what will save us? First, fear God above everything else. Solomon said, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Proverbs 9, verse 10, "If you fear losing money more than losing your soul, you are in danger. If you fear disappointing people more than disappointing God, you are in danger. If you fear missing out on pleasure more than missing out on heaven, you are in danger. Because what you fear most will shape your life." Second, obey God completely. Partial obedience is disobedience. Solomon obeyed God in the beginning, but not in the end. He built the temple, but he also built altars to idols. He preached wisdom, but he did not follow it. And because of that, he lost everything. If we want to avoid his fate, we must obey God fully, not just when it is easy. Third, guard your heart above all else. Guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Proverbs 4, verse 23, Solomon let the wrong things into his heart. And once they were inside, they controlled him. If you do not guard your heart, temptation will take root. Sin will spread. And eventually, you will lose your way. That is why this lesson matters. Because no one plans to destroy their life. But if we do not guard our hearts, we will. Final thought, will we learn from Solomon? Solomon did not learn until it was too late. He spent his final days in regret. And his final message was this: fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13, that was his last warning to us. The only question is, will we listen? Because if the wisest man in history could fall into destruction, so can we. Unless we learn from his mistakes, and do not repeat them. The influence of women, a blessing or a curse. 700 wives. 300 concubines. 1,000 women, and 1 destroyed king. Solomon had it all: wisdom, power, wealth, and the direct favor of God. Yet, his greatest downfall came not from war, not from enemies, but from the women in his life. So this raises a difficult question: is a woman's influence a blessing, or a curse? The truth is, it can be both. Because a woman's influence is powerful. It can either build a man up, or tear him down completely. And Solomon's story proves that who you let into your life will shape your destiny. From the very beginning of time, the Bible shows that women have the ability to shape history. Eve influenced Adam to eat the forbidden fruit, leading to the fall of mankind. Sarah influenced Abraham to take Hagar, creating generations of conflict. Delilah influenced Samson to reveal his secret, leading to his death. Jezebel influenced King Ahab, bringing idolatry and destruction to Israel. But at the same time, Ruth influenced Boaz, leading to the birth of King David's bloodline. Esther influenced King Xerxes, saving an entire nation from genocide. Mary submitted to God's will, bringing Jesus Christ into the world. So what does this tell us? It tells us that a woman's influence is one of the most powerful forces in the world. But whether that influence leads to blessing or destruction depends on the heart of the woman, and the wisdom of the man. At first, Solomon's marriages were political moves. He married Pharaoh's daughter to secure an alliance with Egypt. He married Moabite princesses to keep peace with Moab. He married Ammonite and Sidonian women to expand Israel's influence. On the surface, this looked smart. More wives equals more alliances equals more power. But there was one problem. God had warned against this. Do not marry foreign women, for they will turn your hearts toward other gods. Deuteronomy 7, verses 3 through 4, Solomon knew this command. But he ignored it. And eventually, his wives' influence became too strong to resist. They brought their gods into his palace. They convinced him to build altars for their idols. They led him away from the one true God. And in the end, they destroyed him. The fatal mistake: Solomon followed love instead of God. The Bible tells us exactly what went wrong. King Solomon loved many foreign women, and his wives turned his heart after other gods. 1 Kings 11, verses 1 through 4, notice the key words: he loved them. They turned his heart. Solomon's love for women became greater than his love for God. And what you love most will always control you. If you love money most, it will control you. If you love pleasure most, it will control you. If you love people's approval most, it will control you. And if you love a person more than you love God, you will follow them, even if it leads to destruction. That's exactly what happened to Solomon. And that's why who you love matters more than anything. A woman can make or break a man. Solomon's story teaches us one of the most critical truths about relationships: the woman you choose can either push you toward God, or pull you away from him. A good woman will make you stronger. A bad woman will weaken you until you no longer recognize yourself. And history proves this over and over again. Jezebel pushed King Ahab into deeper wickedness. Delilah turned a warrior into a blind, humiliated captive. Solomon's wives turned the wisest man into an idol worshipper. But on the other hand, Esther saved an entire nation with her courage. Mary Magdalene stayed faithful to Jesus even when the disciples fled. The Proverbs 31 woman is described as a blessing that brings honor to her husband and success to her household. The difference is clear. The right woman will push a man toward his purpose. The wrong woman will pull him into destruction. And Solomon chose the wrong women. Modern parallels: how this applies today. You may not be a king with 1,000 wives. But the principle still applies today: the people you allow into your life will shape your future. The wrong influences will weaken your faith. The right influences will strengthen your walk with God. And the greatest influence in a man's life? The woman he chooses. Modern warning signs: if a woman respects God, she will help you grow. Ignores God, she will lead you away. Encourages obedience, she is a blessing. Pushes compromise, she is a trap. Because who you marry is not just about romance, it's about destiny. And Solomon's story is proof of what happens when you choose wrong. What can we learn from Solomon? So how do we avoid his mistakes? Lesson 1: Character matters more than beauty. Charm is deceptive, and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Proverbs 31, verse 30, Solomon had the most beautiful women on earth. But their beauty could not save him. Because in the end, character is more powerful than attraction. And if a woman's heart is not right, her beauty will become a trap. Lesson 2: Love should never replace obedience to God. Solomon worshipped false gods because he loved his wives more than he loved God. But Jesus said, "Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me." Matthew 10, verse 37, love is not an excuse to disobey God. And if love is pulling you away from him instead of toward him, it is not love, it is deception. Lesson 3: A woman's influence is powerful, so choose wisely. A woman's influence is not neutral. She will either push you toward your purpose, or she will pull you into destruction. And if the wisest man in history was deceived, that means anyone can be. So choose wisely. Because the right woman will bring you closer to God. But the wrong woman, she can take everything from you. Just ask Solomon. The ultimate lesson of Solomon: the truth you cannot ignore: the wisest man in history made the most foolish choices. The king who had everything still lost it all. The man who built the temple of God also built altars for demons. Solomon's life is one of the greatest paradoxes in human history. He had more wisdom than any man before or after him, yet he still fell into sin. He had more wealth than any king in the world, yet he died knowing it was all meaningless. He had a direct encounter with God, yet he still turned away. So what was the final lesson of Solomon's life? What is the one truth he learned too late, but we cannot afford to ignore? In his last recorded words, Solomon gives us the answer. And it is the most important truth in the world. The man who had everything, and found it was nothing by the end of his life, Solomon was a broken man. The kingdom he built was already falling apart. The wealth he accumulated could not bring him peace. The wisdom he gained could not undo his mistakes. And in his old age, he wrote one last book, Ecclesiastes. A book of regret. A book of reflection. A book where he finally admitted the truth about everything he had spent his life chasing. And he summed it up in one of the most haunting verses in the Bible: meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 2, let that sink in. This is not a poor man speaking. This is not someone who failed in life. This is Solomon, the richest, wisest, most powerful man of his generation. And after decades of chasing pleasure, money, success, and knowledge, he comes to one shocking conclusion: none of it matters. The three things that did not satisfy Solomon throughout Ecclesiastes. Solomon looks back on his life and analyzes everything he pursued. And one by one, he exposes them as empty. First, wisdom could not save him. Solomon thought wisdom would give him the answers to life. And yet, after gaining more wisdom than any man before him, he said, with much wisdom comes much sorrow, the more knowledge, the more grief. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 18, because the more he understood the world, the more he saw its pain, its injustice, and its brokenness. Wisdom could reveal the truth, but it could not fix the problem. And in the end, wisdom alone was not enough. Second, pleasure left him empty. After wisdom failed to satisfy him, Solomon turned to pleasure. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired, I refused my heart no pleasure. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 10, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. He threw lavish feasts. He drank the finest wine. He surrounded himself with entertainment and laughter. And yet, after indulging in every pleasure imaginable, he still felt empty. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Ecclesiastes 2, verse 11, no matter how much pleasure he consumed, it never lasted. Because pleasure is temporary, but emptiness always returns. Third, wealth meant nothing in the end. Solomon was the richest man alive. His kingdom was overflowing with gold, silver, and treasures from every nation. Yet when he looked at his wealth, he realized, whoever loves money never has enough, whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. Ecclesiastes 5, verse 10, money could buy everything, except true happiness. Money could give him power, but not peace. Money could build a kingdom, but it could not stop death. And in the end, Solomon realized, everyone comes naked from their mother's womb, and as everyone comes, so they depart. They take nothing from their toil that they can carry in their hands. Ecclesiastes 5, verse 15, no matter how rich you are, you will leave this world with nothing. So what was the point? Solomon's final answer, the only thing that matters after everything, after wisdom, after money, after pleasure, Solomon finally understood the truth. And he gives us his final conclusion in the last chapter of Ecclesiastes, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 13, that is the lesson of Solomon's life. Everything else fades. Only God remains. Only obedience matters. Because in the end, God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. Ecclesiastes 12, verse 14, that is the ultimate truth. That is the reality no one can escape. Because in the end, God will judge us all. Not by our money. Not by our success. Not by our pleasure or power. But by whether or not we followed him. The lesson we cannot ignore. Solomon's story is not just history. It is a warning. Because his mistakes are the same mistakes people are making today. People chase money, but money cannot save them. People chase pleasure, but pleasure always fades. People chase knowledge and success, but none of it will matter in the end. Solomon's life proves a terrifying truth: you can have everything the world offers, and still be empty inside. You can have all the success in the world, and still stand before God with nothing. And at the end of his life, Solomon finally understood this. The question is, will we learn from his mistakes? Or will we repeat them? Final thought, will we listen? Solomon ignored God's warnings until it was too late. But before he died, he left us one last message. A message that we cannot afford to ignore. A message that is more urgent today than ever before. And it is this: fear God. Obey him. Because nothing else matters. That is the truth we cannot ignore. That is the lesson Solomon learned too late. But for us, it is not too late. The only question is, will we listen? Solomon's story is a warning to all of us. Because no one plans to destroy their life. No one expects to lose their way. But if the wisest man in history could be deceived, so can we. That's why it's so important to keep learning, keep growing, and keep seeking the truth. If you found this lesson valuable, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Because Solomon learned the truth too late, but we still have time. Don't wait until it's too late. Subscribe now. Keep learning. And most importantly, stay close to God.